Hey folks, welcome to Play by Play. For whatever reason, I think it's lighting because I'm next to a big window. So sometimes the virtual background just like really doesn't work well for me. And today it was being extremely picky. So we're gonna do this just while we're doing some discussion. So I want to kick off today talking about Paradise Killer, which we finished yesterday, and was really good. I hope everybody else enjoyed that as much as I did. I thought it was a extremely interesting and well developed game. That had some problems, but none of the problems were serious enough to sort of wreck the experience for me. So I thought it was really cool. I have some talking points, and I've gotten a couple of questions on Twitter. But if folks have things that they want to talk about, go ahead and post that. Because we'll get to stuff, and I think that'll be fun. So I want to just start by, I don't know if it makes sense to do sort of like a summary of the experience, because I think we'll hit on a lot of specific topics in discussion points, but I do think it's worthwhile to compare this game with some of the other games that we've played in the past, and specifically what comes to mind is Lucifer Within Us, which we played late last year. If you'll remember, that was the sort of the diorama game, the sort of like time control game, where you were a investigator with a church, and you had to sort of exorcise demons who were controlling people and causing them to commit crimes. And I think there's some obvious parallels between that and Paradise Killer, in both the genre. They're both mystery-solving detective games, and in the frankly, there's like some very close parallels in the type of world they are building. They're both these sort of like religiously dominated dystopian alternate realities. One of them is high tech. Lucifer Within Us is sort of all about like cryptomancy, and Paradise Killer is less about that. It's more sort of modern. It's more sort of like a contemporary technology, but still in this like ritualistic blood cult sort of magic. But they're doing this world building in kind of similar, or at least parallel ways. And I went back and looked briefly at Lucifer Within Us and sort of what my thoughts were at the end of that experience, which was basically that it was too short, right? That that game was 3 levels, 3 little mysteries. It was only a couple of hours long, and it had a really ambitious world that it was trying to build, that it was trying to sort of get across, and it felt like there just wasn't enough space to do that, which tracks for me because I think Paradise Killer is doing a very similar sort of thing, and what allows it to pull that off is that it has so much more space. It's funny playing games on stream is very different. I don't know if it's me or the stream. I mean, I do like stop and talk about stuff quite a bit, but Paradise Killer is supposed to be like a 12-hour game. I think it took me like 25 to finish it, which is long even for me. Like, I usually think it's 50% or 60% longer when I play a game on stream than what the sort of how long to beat guesstimate is. But this was really long, and you feel all of that space. Like, the world building largely gets parceled out in little drips that you get one bit at a time, and I think that's maybe the strongest part of Paradise Killer as a game, is the way that it builds the world over time, the way that it sort of constructs this mythology, and less the sort of technology of the world, or even the day-to-day business of the world, and more the sort of sense of cosmology and good and evil, and the sort of great powers, and how this civilization is structured and constructed, and the motivations of characters to sort of want to continue it. I think all of that is done really well. It's done really well over the span of 25 hours. I think that if Lucifer Within Us, and this is basically what I said at the time, but I think if Lucifer Within Us had 25 hours to sort of do all of that, to develop all of that, that it would have come across much better than it did, which is interesting. Like, I think it's sort of interesting to see that comparison and have that kind of prove out what I was thinking about Lucifer Within Us. The other thing that we talked about a little bit of when I played Lucifer Within Us is the complexity of developing a detective game that is in that style. And if you remember, the way that Lucifer Within Us worked is you would have a couple of characters who were present in a particular scene in like each case, and you could talk to them and they would tell you their story, their version of what happened, and then you could do some investigation, and that investigation would involve forensics. It would involve sort of like observing the crime scene and collecting evidence that way, and it would involve talking to other people and trying to find some piece of data that would contradict a person's story, and then confront them with that, and the response was pretty invariably that they would change their story to incorporate that bit of information, and either say, oh, you're right, I forgot about that, or okay, I was trying to cover up something that was extremely minor and like isn't a big deal, I still didn't do it, which is pretty typical, and was kind of what I was expecting to happen in Paradise Killer, and kind of never did. And thinking about Lucifer Within Us, and one of the issues that we discussed there about the complexity of that, of the actual that means that each character you can talk to has multiple variants on the story that they're telling, that represent the sort of like the current understood narrative from their perspective, which means that like other things in the world need to react to all of those different possible variants, including other characters, right? You need to be able to confront somebody with, well, now the other person is saying this. And that kind of combinatorial explosion of all of the different ways that you could try to disassemble somebody's story, and all of the different ways that then that changes what their story is and how then that affects everything else in the world. That's a mess. It's a mess to write. It's a mess to iterate on. It's a mess to test. And as I recall, Lucifer Within Us didn't do it great. It did okay, but it didn't. That was not like. That wasn't a high point of the game. It fell down a little bit in that sort of like the complexity that it allowed, that it presented, versus sort of all of what seems like it should have been possible. And Paradise Killer sidesteps that problem fairly neatly. Like, it doesn't feel great in Paradise Killer. It's a little bit frustrating to have characters, instead of changing their story, just say, well, no, you're wrong, or you're lying, or you're making it up. None of that evidence that you found that contradicts my story is relevant to me. I don't care about any of it. None of it changes what I'm going to say. That could be frustrating at times, but it meant that the game didn't need to track all of the different excuses that characters could come up with. Instead, the game was really just concerned with, here's a fairly static narrative presentation of everybody's story. It's up to you to poke all of the possible holes in that. And then instead of gradually chipping away at those alibis until we find the sort of the truth that somebody confesses to, which is a pretty standard, like a typical format, typical structure. Instead of that, we're going to have some kind of a scale of, did you find enough contradictory evidence? Did you poke enough holes in a story that the judge, right, this embodiment, the game's embodiment of measuring that, right, just some sort of a scale of, did you do it enough, is going to give you a pass or a fail, right? And it's not a perfectly like elegant solution. It doesn't feel great, but it does totally sidestep, totally get around this exploding complexity problem, and allows the game to instead focus on sort of other things that it's more interested in. And it works, right? Like it is narratively consistent. It's just a little bit frustrating. The other game that I was thinking of when I was sort of wrapping up in my head Paradise Killer is Sherlock Holmes Crimes and Punishments, which you may remember. It is a game that we played like 3 years ago, back in 2018. And if you will recall, it's a Sherlock Holmes game in a Sherlock Holmes franchise, a little bit like the Nancy Drew franchise, right? There's just a series of Sherlock Holmes games. They don't have the same kind of interface or engine consistency that the Nancy Drew games have. They're all they're quite different from one another, but the Crimes and Punishments one, the marketing hook for it was that this is a game that doesn't follow the standard linear detective story structure of like a Phoenix Wright game, where Phoenix Wright kind of only has one conclusion, right? There are, if I remember correctly, like there are things that you can do that will cause you to lose the game, and then you lost the game, like reload a save. But there's no way for you to there's not multiple endings where you could get something wrong or miss a piece of evidence or decide not to accuse somebody of something for moral reasons or out of pity or whatever. And crimes and punishments, the gimmick was sort of like, we're not going to do that. We're going to present you all of the evidence, or we're going to, create a world where you can encounter all of the evidence. And then it's up to you to draw your own conclusions. And you've got a bunch of suspects, and you can sort of determine how you think the crime went down. And you're Sherlock Holmes, so people are going to trust you. And they're going to do what you say, regardless of whether it was actually true or not. And I did not remember a lot of how that game went. I stopped playing about 4/5 of the way through, and we played Consulting Detective instead. I think because I was really frustrated with how this played out. Because as a gimmick, it's really interesting. This idea that you aren't, your decisions aren't validated by a system that has an absolute knowledge, right? Instead, you are making choices that may be right or wrong, and the consequences of those choices can follow you as you go. In effect, the consequences of your choices didn't really follow you. They really just sort of like, each case was a pretty individual little case. And outside of, I think, a little bit of incidental dialogue, it didn't matter what you chose to do earlier. It's not like those characters hung around and you would see them or not or whatever. So instead it felt like, okay, this is just like a bunch of individual stories where I'm choosing what I think the solution is, and the game is not giving me feedback on what the actual solution is. And in fact, built into the game, there was a don't press this button option that would show you what the correct solution was, or not. It wouldn't show you what the correct solution was. It would show you whether you had gotten it right or not. At the end of playing, after we got through 4 cases, I went in and I looked at it, and I had gotten 2 of them right and 2 of them completely wrong. And the game didn't give any feedback even then about what did I get wrong or how did I get it wrong. And I looked it up on the internet, and I wasn't satisfied with the answer that was on the internet. So that was kind of a little bit of a disaster in terms of implementing this feature. That was kind of interesting. It was sort of it's an interesting idea, but it didn't really work out. And I was thinking about that when I was thinking about Paradise Killer, because Paradise Killer does something very similar. It gets to the end, and the judge says you have to present evidence, and there's some kind of a bar of, did you present enough evidence to make a case, or even to present a case, right? Some of the things that we found that then we opened cases on, not KHX, but there was a whole case about there was a whole case about the demon, I think. I don't remember, but there were cases that we opened because of things that we found that were wrong, that were related. The whole thing with Grace Bloodlines, I think that was not part of our initial purview. Anyway, there's some bar for presenting that evidence, but then actually you're given a gun and told, you know what? whether or not you were able to prove it in court, the punishments are up to you. You can decide who was guilty, and you can decide to execute them. And this was all kind of a formality, but you are in fact given free reign. And so even if you couldn't prove it, you can execute justice. And I found that sort of dissatisfying, and I found it dissatisfying in part because it felt like, well, for two reasons. One was I missed getting some feedback of like, did I figure it out? Was I on the right track? Did I miss something? Was there something important that I overlooked? And so that's the first thing that I found kind of a little disappointing about the end of Paradise Killer. And then the other thing is, does it matter, right? Like, the game ends right there, and it ends pretty much the same way, regardless of what you do. I looked up whether there were, multiple endings to this game, and there aren't. There's a kind of ambiguous ending of you are going to accuse some people and you're going to get some people convicted, and then you're going to execute some more people if you want to, and then you're going to leave and go to Perfect Island 25. And that felt kind of hollow to me, especially because I knew that Lydia and Sam committed a crime. And I knew that I had evidence against them, and I didn't present it. And I don't know whether the game knew that or not, right? I don't know if the game could have known that I had made that decision deliberately. But regardless of whether it did or not, I would have liked, I wanted something at the end where I think what I really want is an epilogue where Lydia comes to me and says, it's past now, and there's not really anything you can do about it because we had the trial and now we're moving on. But I was involved in this. I feel like it's important for you to know that. Or something along those lines, where Akiko comes and gloats like you totally missed it. That makes me want to, if I did miss something, makes me want to go back and try to figure it out. And if I didn't, then it makes me sort of feel validated in the decision that I made, right? Yeah, I knew that. I knew that's what would happen. But Crimes and Punishments does that in a very simple way, not narratively, but sort of in this interface. It gives you that validation. You have to ask for it, but it will give it to you. And that was not satisfying. So I don't know that would actually work. And I suspect that there was a version of this game at some point that didn't have the sort of very end where you can go around and murder whoever you want, where it ended after the trial, and then that was the end of the game. And there were players who got stuck in this little possibility space of, I found enough that I have convinced myself of a solution, but I didn't find just exactly the right things in a very adventure gamey kind of a way. I didn't find exactly the right things that the game needed me to find in order to give me the options that I wanted, right? I couldn't accuse, Akiko. I couldn't accuse Akiko because I didn't find the right evidence to accuse her, but I know that she was behind it because I hate her. And I want to something more, something that's not entirely subjective or personal or petty. But, I think there were players who probably got stuck there and were like, I I wanted to be able to execute justice and I wasn't able to. And that, I think, is what that last little bit is a little bit of a release valve for when that happens. But it's interesting to me that, like, some of the things that frustrated me in Paradise Killer about this ending, that I think about how could it have been done differently. Like, it would have been interesting if it was not just the end of the game, if somehow, like, the game went on, or even a little bit, there was like a little bit more, or like, somehow these accusations got stacked on top of each other. I don't know. Our example of a game that tries to do that didn't work. Like, it didn't work the way that I imagine it would work, which I think indicates that it's a hard problem, and that it's probably not something that would have been an easy fix for Paradise Killer either. Also, you couldn't accuse Shinji. It's funny how Shinji ends up getting handled, just from a sort of story perspective. I like that Shinji gives an epilogue, like gives a little bit at the end about what they've learned about human beings. I thought that was really good. And also, Shinji is a clue. Shinji is like a, some people are telling me that there are no demons on the island, but I know that that's not true because Shinji's here. But yeah, there was a hot minute where I thought Shinji might be, like, involved in the murder, in the case, and that was not like that. There was no follow-up on anything like that. Okay, there are folks who have asked questions, so I'm gonna go over there. I'm also I'm a little curious to interrogate the investigation mechanics of this game, but Qbert says, one thing this game does that I really love, it's a detective game set in a crazy world which could easily overload the player at the start with information, but instead of trying to dump all that info at once, it basically lets the player go at their own pace with a bunch of simple, enjoyable exploration, platforming, and collectibles that they can immediately engage with. Would you agree? What's your evaluation of the arc of gameplay? I think that's well put, and I would agree with it. I think that the game still has a bit of a problem with overwhelming the player, not with, I don't know. I don't know if there's a meaningful distinction between, like, lore and setting, or I definitely, in the first maybe even 2 hours, in the first hour certainly of this game, was introduced to a lot, and a lot of it was presented in an open-ended way, because the game allows the player to then sort of figure that stuff out at their own pace. But because I got all of this stuff in an open-ended way about spending 3 million days in an isolation cell, and I don't even remember the first hour of this game. Like, we're looking at weird versions of demon-powered technology where we're talking to Shinji, and Shinji sort of introducing the idea of demons in the world. We're talking to Starlight, and Starlight is, like, analyzing things. We're talking to Lydia, who's driving us around in a flying car. We're collecting relics, and the relics don't seem like they mean anything. And the judge presents us with just, like, here's a lot of stuff, like, KHX is missing. I don't know who that is, but, like, he's missing, and a whole bunch of people were killed, and, like, a whole bunch of other people are involved, and somebody has been caught and charged with the crime. And then you go out into the world, and the world is big and it's unlabeled and it's full of like weird statues of different gods with extremely strange names. And the thing that happened to me is that we very quickly stumbled onto One Last Kiss, and didn't have a way to immediately follow up with that. And I was suffering from a cognitive overload on the narrative of the game that I couldn't sort of make sense of it. I couldn't make sense of who this person was, or why they were meaningful, and what it had to do with the case, or what it had to do with the island, or what it had to do with me. And that ended up being like a real problem of this game is actually pretty good about how it records information for you and how it brings it back, but it's not perfect. I don't know that it could be perfect, but one of the specific ways that its imperfection sort of hurt me was that it didn't record much about that conversation at all. It didn't say, you should meet One Last Kiss in the cemetery. And so I entirely lost that thread, and I had no way to pick it back up except for literally going back and watching the beginning of the game again. So I don't think it's right to say that the game does a perfect job of parceling out information. I don't know what the best way to do that is. Like, it is a big, huge, weird world, and maybe the way that it's structured, you start off in your apartment and there's really nothing there, and then you go out onto the island and you're presented with everything at once. Maybe there's a way that it could have been stepped out a little bit more, so that when you meet Lydia takes you to a stopover point, where you don't meet with the judge right away. You meet with Sam, or I don't know, Dr. Doomjazz or somebody, or a small group of people in a smaller space, where you can start to familiarize yourself with some of these like social institutions that you're going to then use your knowledge of over the course of the rest of the game, because it was a rough start for me. But then once you get started, once it sort of presents all of these open-ended world building questions, the way that it paces out information after that, I think is great. I think is a really, really, really good. And I remember kind of gradually coming to an understanding of not so much stuff about the gods, but some stuff about the timeline, like and how it matches up with Earth Prime, right? Like understanding that this island broke away 1,000 years ago, and before that, all of these people lived on Earth, but it was an Earth that was populated by warring gods, and now they just sort of live on this island in their own separate society. Remember figuring out that the relics were not like religious iconography, which is what relic to me, in a game that has these sorts of religious overtones, relic to me suggests something that has a historical importance, the bones of a saint or something like that. That's not what these relics are. These relics are literally the trash that was left behind when the entire population of this island was killed, and as part of a ritual murder. So it's environmental narrative. It's sort of understanding what happened here based on the things that were left behind when all of these people were sort of were swept up and taken away. That was really cool. Like realizing that and then starting to construct stories about the citizens that lived there based on those relics, and having a lot of them be, trash, having a lot of them be like things of not really a lot of value and not a lot of significance, but piecing them together I thought was really, really, really cool. What was another sort of bit like that? I think coming to understand the chronology of the islands and how some of the previous islands had been fucked up, and understanding the sort of like class distinctions of citizens and syndicate and council and how the politics of that worked, and starting to sort of get a sense of some of the gods in the actual religion. Anyway, all of this gets dripped out, not just paced well, but put into fragments that are spread around in a way that it's really difficult to point to. This is the piece of information that puts it all together, that solves it. Except for in the chat, like folks are mentioning our very last episode before starting the trial, which I also kind of like. That is an amazing thing for me because we almost didn't do any of that. But the very last episode before starting the trial, we went out to try to find one last kiss and try to get into the graveyard, and found an area that we had not found in our platforming and exploration, open world navigation of the world, and talked to two new characters who were absolutely vital characters, linchpin characters in understanding pieces of the case, right? And I'm kind of really curious what it would have been like if we had gone into the trials without doing that. If we had never found One Last Kiss, we'd never found Denon Nigate, and never found the corridors. That's when, for me, the sort of like competing conspiracies solidified, where I sort of understood how that was happening, and then tugging on those threads, I think, is how we sort of built actual, or at least for me, mentally, how I came to understand the cases against different characters. So it would have been interesting to see, like, what do the actual trials look like if you miss that, like I almost did. Yeah, I that was a pretty cool moment of solving the case, basically, because we had so much information, and we just needed a little bit more in order to piece it together. But for me, there's really two layers to this game. There's a layer of the world of Paradise, this sort of iterative island that has its own social and political structure, its own kind of technology, its own religious context, and its own aesthetic, and then the actual mystery, the sort of case that we're trying to solve. And I think that the world building was done better than the case. And I think that part of what like really resonates about this game is less the case, although the case ends up being pretty cool. It's less about the case, though. It's more about sort of the world that it's set in and how I gradually came to understand that world. Okay, I'm gonna keep going through some of the chat questions. I see. Okay, sorry, I'm behind on the. There we go. All right. There are a couple of more questions, but Kyla asks, so I didn't actually watch you play this game, so feel free to skip this question if you don't think it's relevant, but I was curious. Do you think the wild world building of this game was necessary to the core mystery, or could a more or less similar mystery have been written in a more realistic world? I mean, it depends on what you're really asking, because I think there are a couple of different questions here. I will say that I think the wild world building is core to the experience of this game. And if you made this same game in a more familiar world with the same kind of mystery plot and the same mechanics for the game, or adjusting that as necessary, I think it would be a far less interesting game, and I think it would lose a lot of the subjective feel of being an investigator that the game has. I said this before, but I think a lot of the feel of investigating in this game has more to do with understanding the world than understanding the mystery. And there are some good moments of understanding the mystery too. But that's also where there's a lot of frustrating bits in the narrative. There's a lot of rote, tedious stuff in the mechanics and the interface. Stuff that's just not great in the mystery. But you are at the same time, you're doing all of this world discovery, this sort of larger narrative of the world. And that consistently made me feel like an investigator, even though that's not stuff that was new to Love Dies. This is out of character, but for me, I felt like I was piecing together this mystery at the same time that Love Dies was piecing together a mystery. They were just different mysteries. The world building made it easier to forgive the game for other flaws. Absolutely true. I think that if this game was done without all of that wild, crazy world, it would be a lesser game, and you would be more frustrated by the frustrating stuff, and more angry annoyed at the interface and things like that. That said, the mystery is also pretty good, and it took me a long time to come around to an appreciation of it, because maybe because it was well done, but because it was very, very confusing. It was very muddled for a long time, really until the very end, really until finding One Last Kiss, at least. But the structure of not quite the Orient Express, but this is a crime that was committed by two distinct groups, two distinct individuals or two conspiracies that were unaware of one another, and not working together, but working towards the same ends, and trying to pin the crime on a third party, so that as a player, I very quickly find evidence that discounts the story that everybody's telling, right? Everybody wants me to believe that it's Henry that's behind everything, and it's clearly not Henry. But beyond that, it seems like everybody's keeping secrets, and it's not clear how those secrets connect to one another. In a traditional mystery with a traditional solution, that's usually because people are hiding things that are either unrelated or only tangentially related to the crime. And you've got like Doomjazz, right? You've got Dr. Doomjazz, who is secretive and misleading, because he's got his own thing going on. Like, he's having relationships with citizens that he's not supposed to have, and he's got like a whole secret entrance to his harbor, whatever, in order to accommodate that, and he's not going to tell you about it because it makes him look bad, but it's not related to the crime. Usually detective stories have a lot more of that. People who are suspicious, who end up being guilty of different things that aren't of interest to you. And this game managed to have a lot of people who were suspicious because they were guilty of different things that all happened to be of interest to you. I thought that was really cool. I liked that. I read some detective fiction, like, and this is related to my thesis, so I guess maybe I read more than most, but I wouldn't claim to be an expert in how you structure mystery stories, but this is something that I haven't really seen before as a solution. I think it's very clever, and I think it was well done, and I think that the details of the world were well constructed, because you do have stuff like Doomjazz, who is suspicious for reasons, and Crimson Acid is suspicious for reasons, and I looked up the severed arm. Remember how we found a severed arm and we're just carrying it around for a long time and couldn't figure out how it connected to anything? There was a ghost somewhere in an apartment building that we never quite found, as one of the like many collectibles that we never found. Not like a whole secret area, but just a ghost somewhere, kind of tucked away enough that we didn't talk to them, and they were looking for their arm, and so that's what the arm was about. But an arm is a like it's unclear what kind of narrative weight that has. It feels like that could be a lead. That could mean something. This report about vampirism? What the heck? What is that? That could mean something. And they don't. They are their own little self-contained stories that help to build the world, that help to sort of color it, but they're red herrings in sort of the most delightfully simple way, right? They're not even suspects who have different unrelated issues. They're literally just clues to other mysteries that you find, and make you doubt, did I find everything? Did I figure out the whole picture? So I think that's all like very thoughtfully constructed and well implemented, well executed. And the overall mystery, I think, is a good mystery. It's a good detective story that that doesn't have to be set in this world, right? Like, you could tell a story about two competing conspiracies that, for reasons, try to commit the same crime at the same time without realizing that somebody else is doing it, and then try to pin it on somebody else because they're the obvious suspect. And I think you would get a similar sort of detective experience of unraveling that case and things not really making sense until they eventually do, until you figure out what's going on. But I think that if you just did that, you know, in a Sherlock Holmes style or a Phoenix Wright style, then it wouldn't be Paradise Killer. I mean, it would lose sort of what makes Paradise Killer special. Was the mystery there as a pretense to explore and get to know the world? I mean, I think they work hand in hand in a really delightful way. Because the other thing I think about... So Phoenix Wright is kind of a... is kind of a template. It's kind of a foundation for this kind of game, as a system for presenting a mystery that the player is trying to solve. And it's certainly not the only way that you can do it, but it's kind of a baseline that, for me at least, it makes sense to measure a lot of other things against. And the way that works is you have a phase of gathering evidence, and you have a phase of interrogating people. And while you are gathering evidence, as a player, you have to be doing something where you're trying to find all of the evidence that exists in the world. And in Phoenix Wright, you're playing this kind of 2D adventure pixel hunt game where you're trying to tap on all the right things. In Sherlock Holmes Crimes and Punishments, you are walking around in a 3D world, but you're doing pretty much the same thing. You're collecting these clues by, like, if I go into the shed, do I find spatters of blood in the corner? Like, let me click on that and add it to my inventory of clues. Paradise Killer is exactly the same thing. You're going around, you're looking for clues. But what this game does is it situates those clues inside of a platformer rather than an adventure game, right? And I think arguably adventure games are not the fun part. The fun part of adventure games is not the pixel hunting, is not the, like, clue finding. The fun part of platformers is the collectibles. The fun part of a Mario game is getting all of the coins. Not the only fun part, but, like, that is an inherently fun activity, and it's a way to it's an understandable structure for goals and objects that exist in the world that are not just meaningful because they have narrative weight, but are desirable because they have this sort of a fun challenge, right? Like, that's a thing that is fun about playing those games. And so this is a game that says, okay, well, so instead of just walking around in a 3D world and looking in the corners for blood splatter, like, you're going to jump around in a platformer, and instead of collecting coins, you're going to collect things, and 99% of those things aren't going to be important to the case. But they're also not going to be irrelevant. They're going to be sort of world building in this very fragmented, tiny droplet sort of a way. But one time out of 100, you're going to find the piece of evidence that you need, that you're looking for, right? That helps you solve the case. That then you can take back to your interrogation phase and use as evidence against people's alibis. I think that's brilliant. I think that's really smart. I hadn't thought about it before. I think there are other games that try to do something similar. I have not played... I'm not even going to remember the name of a game that came out last year that used Picross as a mechanic, which Picross is like a traditional sort of abstract puzzle game, like a crossword or a Sudoku, that's been around for a long time, that involves constructing images. Zyvo, do you remember what it was called? I don't remember the name of it. But in this case, like, you can... Murder by Numbers. Thank you very much. Murder by Numbers is the name of the game. By constructing these images using Picross mechanics, you are discovering clues that are relevant to the case that you're trying to solve. I think that's also really clever. I haven't played that game, so I can't really speak to how effective it is, how well it works. But I can say that for Paradise Killer, similar kind of idea. Instead of just like a pixel hunty kind of grind for clues, which is maybe being overly dismissive. Maybe that's pat. Like, I think in the ideal case, the Sherlock Holmes or Nancy Drew or even Phoenix Wright should be more like Gone Home, where you're not pawing through, but you're sort of like sifting. You're sifting through objects, all of which tell stories, looking for the stories that are relevant, right? It's just that those games don't tend to do that well because it's hard to make a game like Gone Home. And so they don't live up to that standard, and the looking for evidence is not the fun part. Whereas in Paradise Killer, looking for evidence was absolutely the fun part. I didn't even think about it as looking for evidence. I thought about it as platforming and finding stuff along the way. And that was pretty cool. I think that was really neat. Okay, there were a bunch of questions. There were 3 questions that I got on Twitter from Toby WM that were great questions. So I want to hit on them too. They are, and we've maybe talked some about some of this stuff, but the first one is Toby says, I'm curious how you think the experience would change if you had found Crimson Acid and or One Last Kiss earlier instead of late in the game. And I think that's a great question. I think it's interesting. This question actually suggests for me a different thing, which is interesting, that I really found both of those very late. And I wonder if that was just me. Is that common? At what point do most people find those characters and have those conversations? Because for Crimson Acid, it wasn't the end game. But it was quite a while after I could have talked to her. And she helped put together a lot of big parts of the mystery. For me, at a moment where I think I was really frustrated by how little new information I was getting out of interrogations, because this game is not about its interrogations. The interrogations are really secondary to the sort of world exploration, clue finding. I think that holds up. I mean, you still have to do them. You still have to sort of compare people's stories to one another. You have to do a lot of I found a thing and I'm going to talk to one person about it, and then I have to talk to another person about that. This game actually has like a lot of that. But typically as a player, I'm not getting like really juicy, interesting, good information out of that. The way that when I found Crimson Acid, and she was like, hey, I'm an information broker. Like, it'll cost you a little bit of money, which you have a lot of, but I'll tell you interesting things about all kinds of people and all kinds of stuff relevant to your case. And that like really sort of opened up the floodgates in an interesting way. Crimson Acid happened early enough in the game, sort of like, I don't know if that was halfway or 2/3 of the way through the game that I finally talked to her. But it was early enough that I don't think it made a huge difference in my overall experience of the mystery. I think if I had found her earlier, it would have mitigated some of the frustration that I had around the interrogation phase of this game, which again, like, is not only not what it concentrates on, but is not great. It is in the catalog of mystery games where part of what you're doing is confronting suspects and trying to get to know them and trying to get to know their stories and poke holes in their stories. Paradise Killer does not do that well. It's just because that's not what the game cares about, and because that's not what you as a player really care about, you can overlook that part of it. But I think that it would have eased some of my frustration with that if I had found Crimson Acid earlier, because Crimson Acid, is sort of an antidote to that. Like, is a place where you can talk to a person who will just give you information rather than presenting you with more and more walls. So I think that's a thing. One Last Kiss is interesting because I'm not 100% sure how much earlier I could have found her. I think in an ideal pacing, I would not have I would have done what I was supposed to do. I mean, it all comes back to the map, right? I think what the game wanted me to do, without holding my hand about it, is it wanted me to investigate the scene of the crime, to go like look at, hey, there were some people here who were murdered, and then there's like a space thing and a code. There's a lock that requires a code that you have to figure out. And then after I did that, go start exploring around by talking to probably Akiko first, maybe Lydia at some point, although Lydia's not actually that interesting, and then Crimson Acid, because Crimson Acid had sort of like pinged me to like hit those 2 or 3 spots first after I investigated the crime scene, and then start exploring the island, right? And then start sort of finding other people. Instead, the first thing that I did was climb a big stairway, because there was a big stairway and I didn't know where the heck I was going or like what any of this stuff was. I climbed a big stairway and met One Last Kiss, who seemed cool, but I didn't understand anything she was saying. And then she disappeared, and I jumped off of a mountain and landed on Dr. Doomjazz's boat. And I was like, I don't know who this is or what's going on. This is all very confusing. And then I started going around. I talked to, most of the cast before I finally went back and looked at the scene of the murder. And all of that was kind of backwards, and it worked. It all worked, But I think the murder mystery would have been paced out better if I had done some of those things differently. If I had found One Last Kiss later in the playthrough the first time. So then, assuming that I did that and she was on my radar, what did I need to do to find her a second time? Maybe it's not much. I needed to get into the ziggurat, and I needed to sort of go through the ziggurat into the cemetery, and there were I had to do the nightmare computers in the cemetery. I think there were nightmare computers in the cemetery that I needed to do. So I do think that my second visit with One Last Kiss was locked behind find all 3 of the nightmare computers, which means do quite a bit of exploration of the island, and figure a lot of other stuff out. So I don't think that it was possible for me to find her very early. It's possible for me to find her before the very last thing, but I think if you were to structure this game out in terms of based on mostly nightmare computers, but also a couple of other locks and gates, there's stuff that you can do at the very beginning, and then there's stuff that you can do in the middle, and then there's stuff that you can only do at the end after you've done, some significant stuff in the middle. Things like exploring the barracks, it wasn't barracks, was it? Whatever, exploring the garrison or Akiko's little building with the guards. You had to do some other stuff before you could do that. Finding some of the cell tower stuff that we did, a lot of the stuff that was locked behind nightmare computers that we eventually found out. And One Last Kiss, I think, is one of them. So, maybe I could have found Denonegate before I had figured out, that he had to exist. And before the game sort of weirdly prompted me that, yeah, he's probably on the island somewhere, and you could find him. And then that would have changed things a little bit, but just in terms of maybe that wouldn't have been the linchpin moment. Maybe then I would have had to find some other stuff and go back to Carmelina, and then talking to Carmelina, I would have realized oh shit, that's her. I don't know. It's hard for me to say exactly. I think it wasn't bad for me to find One Last Kiss at the end. I do think it would have been bad if I had gone to trial without finding One Last Kiss. I think I would have been much more adrift, and I think I would have gotten some weird results out of the trials and had a hard time sort of putting together exactly what happened. I mean, maybe not, because the trial is also structured in a great way of, if you have evidence against someone, you can accuse them. And if they did it, then they're likely to point the finger at somebody else. And that might give you a sense of how some of these conspiracies, one of the conspiracy was structured. And if you have enough information, even if you were not clear on the overall structure of these competing conspiracies, then you might have been able to put some of that together in the trial, I guess. I think it would have helped if the game had only showed characters on your special vision thingy after they contact you, like Crimson does, and have it so other characters ping you at different points. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting idea. I think you could also do something with, the world is kind of separated into different districts. And one of the things that's nice about the world building is that these districts kind of flow into one another. But that also makes it harder to compartmentalize in your head what the structure of the world is. And you could take an approach of these districts are more distinct from one another. They're more sort of obviously, this is the luxury apartments, and now you are crossing into the non-luxury apartments, and now you're crossing into the beach. Like I said, it certainly has those districts. There's just they could have them more visually differentiated, or emphasize their borders a little bit more, and then have a person in each one of the districts or something like that, so that you would, to help structure the way that you encounter them a little bit more. Now I'm talking through that, I don't know that that would help any great deal. I do like the idea of having them introduce themselves to you, and to kind of controlling that a little bit better in terms of what order that happens in and the timing of it. I think that's sort of interesting. Skincell makes sort of a really good narrative point of there's kind of a problem at the end of the game where we executed our only architect, and how are we going to get any more islands? If Perfect 25 isn't perfect, like, are we screwed because we don't have an architect anymore? I do think that, like, this is a bit that's unclear to me about the lore, the world building, because we do have a library, and we do have some vague number of other syndicate members. I'm not sure that we couldn't train up another architect. Like, clearly the game makes some of the what Carmelina can do is inherited, right? Is tied to her blood. But I don't know that is, like, why her family and not somebody else. In the logic of the game, I think it has to do with her family sort of did the thing, performed some kind of a spell that gave them that power, or made a pact with a god or something, where they got it. And the reason that nobody else has done it, the reason that we only have one architect, is that we already have an architect. And this society, I think, is, like, super lazy about actually getting shit done. If we already have an architect, then why would anybody, like, go through the trouble of being another architect? Like, that seems like a lot of work. And now that we don't have one, I don't know that, like, we couldn't get one. And I think that, like, if that was a priority for the council, I think it fits into the world in my mind that it could happen. Now, that said, like, our only exorcist was killed 10 years ago, or 10 years ago. Our only exorcist was killed, and nobody bothered to figure out how to be another exorcist. But to me, that plays into it. Like, if we don't need another, so we might have screwed ourselves over, because our society is designed in such a way that it's not until it's evident that we need a new island is anybody going to bother to figure out how to build it. And by then it might be too late, because some of these other islands seem like they ended pretty damn fast. So yeah, I don't know, but I do think that there's a story way in which it doesn't have to be an absolute disaster. Yeah. Cool. This was really good. Okay, so I'm going to... We've talked about this for a long time, so let me hit these last couple of questions from Twitter. And then maybe we move on, because like we could talk about this more, but then it's a lot of talking. I know. Okay, so Toby WM continues. Thoughts about onboarding info overload from the start and managing it. I feel like we've talked about that a fair bit, right? And I think that overall the game is really well paced in its information, in how it doles out sort of story bits and case bits, with the exception of the beginning, where I was very overloaded. And that said, I don't have a great solution for it, because just in general, this is the way that the game... I think typically the way that it happens is that the game presents you with a world that is mostly like a familiar world. And you as a player can make assumptions about the way that the world works, being based on what you expect. And gradually over time, the game shows you that no, this thing that you assumed worked in a way that is familiar and recognizable actually works in a totally different way for all of these different reasons. So at the very beginning, instead of being presented with like, here's a list of really bizarre things, you're presented with, here is a world that looks more or less familiar. And as you explore it, you're going to discover that it is less familiar than you initially expected. And Paradise Killer works that way too. It's just that there's not as much of it that is immediately familiar. More of it is different. And that's part of the appeal, right? Is that you're dropped into this world that is hyper-colored and weird, just very, very strange, and cool. It is a like stylish, cool world, and I think that works for it. So I don't have a great solution. I do think that like if you could figure out a way to step it, so that you are you are put into a slightly smaller space with a slightly smaller cast, and then the world opens up so that you can access the whole island. I also think the suggestion of somehow parceling out the characters that you can talk to, and I would include One Last Kiss and Crimson Acid on that list, that rather than having them available at the beginning, and Crimson Acid like pings you immediately. Crimson Acid, well, she doesn't. She pings you after you talk to one person. I think after you talk to someone, Crimson Acid pings you. I think she should ping you after you talk to like 3 or 4 people. Or almost everybody. Maybe, after you've almost made your rounds the first time, and then you get a text from Crimson Acid. Or put up more gates. Like, open world design has its advantages. And there's some things that it does really well, and there's a cool kind of experience that it creates. But it makes it hard to manage the pace of things. That's what it's bad at. And I think you have to really balance sort of how much open your world is against how much you want to be able to manage the experience that the player is going to have. And sometimes you can get away with, we're not managing this experience at all, but then your experience has to be kind of streamlined. It has to be really light so that the player can have it wherever they go. And I think a lot of really good open world games don't just drop you in the middle of the world. They find ways to gate your experience of it. This one does too, right? Nightmare computers are used for that purpose. But I think maybe that wasn't enough, or like either there was another system that was needed, or those nightmare computers could have been used more extensively to sort of help to guide sort of, because if you guide the player's access to parts of the world, you are effectively guiding how much they have to take in, like how much they're going to encounter at a time. And the last question was, this is great. We can end here, I think, because this is good. Still from Toby on Twitter, wondering how you see the relics now. As early, they seemed mostly to strike you as irrelevant collectible. Has that changed? And I think I addressed this a little bit, but let me just sort of reiterate it, because this is exactly right. I think there was a moment early in the game where I found a collectible, and it was, I don't know, like a magazine, or there were some like really trash collectibles that we found in terms of the relics, where I felt like this doesn't mean anything. I thought that the purpose of those collectibles was to reinforce the sort of general aesthetic of the game, which is this hyper color, kind of hyper color religious trash monster, sort of an aesthetic. I don't know if that's a recognized category, but there's a lot of just like junk that had like cryptic descriptions with too many capitalized words, and early on it very much felt like, okay, yeah, I get it, like this is what you're doing, I see the bit. There's a lot of these collectibles, like, is it real? Are you really gonna just keep doing the same bit? Like, okay. And it's not that. And it is very cool to me. It is very cool to me, and the greatest success of this game, that it dawned on me so gradually that I was learning things about the world from each one of these individual pieces. And I was learning so little that it didn't even register that I was learning anything until I had gathered enough of them, and then in aggregate, as sort of in aggregate, I sort of understood something new about the people that had left them behind. And at that point, it very much shifted my thinking of these relics from, well, these are worthless, but I have to collect them all because they're collectible, and the game has presented them to me as things to collect. And they turned into, these are worthless items that I do not need to collect. They're unimportant. But they have a narrative meaning, and I am genuinely interested in seeing what they are. And for me, that was, I never have like a real completionist attitude towards that kind of thing, of like, well, I gotta collect all of the collectibles. But at the beginning of the game, it seemed like that was what they were for, right? They were for driving a completionist motivation. And by the end of the game, they really felt like take them or leave them. Like, these things are not these are not valuable things. They're just things that are there, but they will shed light on sort of the underlying narrative. And I totally flipped from like really wanting to collect them but not caring about them to feeling pretty okay about not collecting all of them, but caring about the ones that I found. And that was neat. That was like a really, really neat sort of trick that they were able to pull off. Okay, cool. Let's stop there. I have other thoughts about the interface and the interrogation and stuff like that, but I kind of wanna